Well, it's my honor to introduce Gary Hodderson. Gary found Radical Women in the heydays of the feminist movement, and in those days there were a lot of socialists, anarchists, you name it, women's groups to choose from, and we're all very lucky that Gary chose us. She was already, at the time she joined, she was already a veteran of the Berkeley free speech fights. She had been a member of SNCC in Mississippi, registering people to vote, and an anti-Vietnam War activist. Gary is always where the action is. She has been a leader in this organization for decades now, and she is the international chair of the Freedom Socialist Party, our sister organization, as I said. And when I talk about where the action is, in the early 90s, there was a lot of right-wing organizing in this area, and that's not to be surprised because the Aryan Nation had an established compound in Idaho, and this was supposed to be the white homeland, this our Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And they were organizing heavily. Gary was one of the founders of the United Front Against Fascism. And UFAF, and there's some veterans of that here too tonight, spent a decade smashing attempts by the Aryan Nation, the Ku Klux Klan, the Nazi skinheads, Holocaust deniers like David Irving, to get a foothold in the Northwest. Everywhere they showed up to try to organize, UFAF was there to bust up their meetings, and did it most successfully. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Gary.
Thank you. All right. So welcome all tonight. I'm glad you came out on this beautiful sunny summer evening to talk about fascism, which is kind of incongruous with the weather we're having, but it shows you're really dedicated and serious people who really care, and I'm very glad that you came. Thank you for coming. We thought about calling this talk, the rise of creeping fascism, but we decided we liked better stand up to fascist creeps. But they're both true. It's necessary. There is creeping fascism, as we'll talk about tonight, but it's also necessary to stand up to them. I'm going to begin by talking about United Front Against Fascism and tell you some of the history in the Northwest of fighting Nazis, because there are an awful lot of lessons that were learned in the organizing that Radical Women did. And I realized when I started talking on the talk that there are people in our organization that don't really know the history, and I thought it would be very good to share that with you tonight. And I have a short video clip of news coverage from our early organizing, and then later I'll talk more about some of the things that are going on now, that the murder of Dr. Tiller and other, there have been 9 murders by people with affiliations to white supremacists since the beginning of this year, which is really quite unusual. But in 1998, an Ethiopian immigrant named Mulgeta Sarah was murdered in Portland. And shortly after that, in December, just the next month, the Aryan Nations, which was a white supremacist group, and White Aryan Resistance announced that they were going to come to Whidbey Island and hold a memorial for a man named Robert Matthews, who had been killed in a shootout with the FBI on Whidbey Island. And Radical Women members, myself and others said, we can't let them come. We can't let them come and try and organize and recruit youth, which is what they were doing. They were concentrating on trying to get young people to become skinheads. We can't let them come to Seattle and be unopposed after skinheads have just murdered a man in Portland. And the when we made that decision, it really launched us on a decade of organizing against neo-Nazis, against the Aryan nations in Idaho, right-wing homophobes like this crazy nut that came to town the other day and picketed Garfield, anti-communists and anti-feminists who, as Bernadette said, declared the 5 northwestern states of the United States to be the white homeland and were going to export everybody who wasn't white from, try and drive them out of the Northwest. So after the murder of Sirah, we called a meeting, a community meeting, and we proposed that we hold a counter demo at the park where these Nazi skinheads and the Aryan nations were going to be staying for a weekend of as one, and this is an actual quote from one of the newscasters, Seattle newscasters said, well, the Aryans were planning to hold a peaceful cross burning on Whidbey Island. I am not, I didn't make that up. I'm sure we have the footage. And so we held our public meeting, and, you know, a lot of people came, and we had a debate. What should we do? Some people thought it was way too dangerous to go out and picket and organize against the Nazis. We should do something here in Seattle. They thought it was too confrontative. What were some of the, it was suicidal. That was another argument. And a really healthy debate ensued in that community meeting. And when the vote was taken, the majority of people at the meeting said, we need to go out there and we can't let them come to Seattle. And it's irrelevant to hold something down at the federal courthouse in Seattle when they're going to be recruiting on Whidbey Island. We voted on a name that night, which was the United Front Against Fascism, and we made leaflets calling on people to join us. And we notified the press that we were going to be there, and went down to Pike Place Market and started handing out our flyers. And by gosh, it was a big issue because of the murder of Mulgeta Sirah. So the press came down and covered us, and really we only had, I can't remember exactly how long it was. Was it 5 days? Well, I knew it wasn't much time, but in 5 days, we organized a demonstration at this state park on Whidbey Island. The gay community provided the buses for us. We took 4 buses out to Whidbey Island. Part of the reason was that Robert Matthews, the man they were going to hold a memorial for, had tried to bomb gay bars in Seattle. So the gay community felt strongly about the issue. World War II vets and Vietnam vets and labor activists helped to provide security at Whidbey Island. RW members gathered endorsements from unions and from community organizations. We took flyers to Whidbey Island to let the people know there what our plans were. We held a press conference with the NAACP, and we answered all the attacks in the media. And there were a lot of attacks in the media. We were characterized as the ones bringing violence to Whidbey Island. We were not the Nazis. They were just going to hold a peaceful camp out, and we were.
And we wouldn't leave alone.
And we were the ones, the dangerous radicals. We took 4 busloads of people and cars. Were about, I would say, about 400 people at the demonstration. There was a bomb threat on the ferry. We went with our 4 buses to get on the ferry, and there was a bomb threat. The only bomb threat I've ever heard of on a Seattle ferry, and long before those goons that they've got now that circle the ferries constantly looking for terrorists. You know who I'm talking? The militarized Homeland Security guys. Yeah. Now it's. But at that time there was an actual bomb threat by Nazis. They held the ferry up for half an hour, looked at the bottom of the ferry, and said, "Well, there doesn't seem to be a bomb, so you can go." So we got in our buses and went and headed out to the state park. our drivers got ticketed by the police, who basically did not want us to come at all, considered us also the problem. They ticketed our drivers for crossing the fog line, which you may never have heard of a fog line. I didn't know what a fog line is. The fog line is the white line on the right-hand side of the road that keeps you from going off the road but who's ever heard of a ticket for a fog line? That was harassment by the police. But we got out there, and we were not shot at on the way out, as the FBI had promised that we would be shot as we left the ferry. I'm not making any of this up. This is all true. I have witnesses here in this room.
There's news footage.
There's news footage. Yes, that's right. So they predicted that we would all there would be sharpshooters there waiting for us that would get us, or they would get us on the ferry. We would be trapped on the ferry. None of that happened. And the media had made a big deal out of the fact that people at Whidbey Island didn't want us to come. We were outsider agitators coming to disrupt peaceful Puyallup, Whidbey Island. But when we got there, the first person that I'll never forget it, that was there in his Army uniform, was a World War II vet from Whidbey Island. And he said, I am so glad you're here. I'll never forget it. You never know where you're going to get support. Well, what about the Aryans? Did they come in great numbers? Well, no, they didn't come in great numbers. They turned out to be a tiny group of young boys, teenagers, who had been abandoned by their leaders. They were there by themselves, and their big leaders didn't show up until after we had left. We picketed for 3 hours waiting for the leaders to come. But at some point we said, well, this is, we can't picket here all night. So when we left, then the head of the Aryan Nations in Idaho came to the rally. Well, this demonstration was broadcast all over the world. It was really quite amazing. You really couldn't imagine it. But people who were traveling in Europe, I remember, called me and said, "My God, I saw you guys on television. What's going on over there?" And it became an international, really an international symbol of resistance to the attempt of Nazis to intimidate people. Then, following the demonstration, a debate ensued. And I want to tell you about the debate because whenever you're involved in fighting, standing up to white supremacists and fascists and so on, this debate always occurs. It occurs everywhere. Our Radical Women branches in other cities, in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, have all been involved in organizing around to stand up to white supremacists and to out-and-out Nazis. And the debate always becomes the same. The question is it right to be a militant, disciplined, multiracial, gay, straight, poor and working class, united militant front against the Nazis, or should we be more passive and much nicer when the Nazis come out? Much more civil, engage in civil. And usually this is how the debate ensues. The cops, the FBI, the Federal Office of Civil Rights, elected officials, and liberal pacifists will all say that you should tone it down quite a bit. In our case, we also had a couple of NGOs called the Washington Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, and also the Southern Poverty Law Center, which opposed militant action. The Washington Coalition Against Malicious Harassment was partially funded by the police, which explains their opposition. And Southern Poverty Law Center makes a lot of money scaring the bejesus out of people about the threat of violence. The arguments that these groups would make fell into basically 5 basic arguments. One is we should ignore the Nazis because they're just fringe groups. And if you ignore them, we heard some of those arguments when, what is the name of that Fred Phelps. When Fred Phelps came out, there was a debate at the school. Some of the teachers said, well, you should just ignore him. Well, don't organize a demonstration against him. So that's one. Another one is, an argument is, well, what we need to do is engage in passive, silent protests. If the Nazis march down the streets, which they were doing regularly in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, the businesses should close their businesses as a protest and tie yellow ribbons around the storefronts. And this was this was passive resistance and a statement. And there was another, the other thing was turn your back. If the Nazis are marching, you simply turn your back as your statement against against them. Another argument is, well, this isn't really a civic problem. This is a police problem. So leave the handling of Nazis because they're a bunch of lawbreakers up to the police. The fourth one is, well, what we need to do is outlaw all hate groups and outlaw hate speech. But hate is an emotion, not a political ideology. And who's to say what's hate? If you say, smash the Nazis, is that hate speech? Well, it depends on which side of the line you're on. If the Nazis are going to smash you and you say smash the Nazis, that's an act of self-defense. So the idea of outlawing groups or outlawing hate speech, for one thing, all it does is drive groups underground. It doesn't expose them, which is one of the ways of confronting Nazis. And finally, the worst way that I ever heard that was advocated and actually done in Idaho was that, well, if the Nazis march, what we should do is use it as a fundraiser. We'll have people pledge money on the number of Nazis that march. So if 15 march, we'll use it to raise money. And this will be our form of protest against the Nazis. And it was called the Lemons into Lemonade campaign, and was advocated by a group and done by a group over in Spokane. We in UFAF and in Radical Women countered all of these arguments with these things. First of all, Nazis are not any ordinary criminals. They have a clear ideology. They have international organizations. They have a clear political goal, which is to rule society, and they have support in high places among people who agree with them. But are not out about it. There's the police, public officials, there's folks with money. In Idaho, there was one of the men who was funding the Aryan Nations was a very, very well-to-do entrepreneur, and he was giving the Aryan Nations tons of money to print materials and to keep going. The only way the only way to counter Nazis, and when I go into more about what's happening in Europe, you'll realize that Nazis really do have a goal, an objective of becoming a mass movement to take over governments. But the only way to defeat them is to build a mass movement to oppose them. That has to be that's the way to do it. You also have to educate about the danger and build a mass movement that's based on the trade unions to stand up to them. Why the trade unions, you ask? Because they're organized workers. And ultimately, the fascists want to divide the working class and weaken its ability to fight the bosses. The workers have we as workers have a big stake in rejecting this corrosive and divisive ideology that's put forward by the Nazis. Because if we're divided along race lines, along nationality lines, we can't put up an effective fight to defend our rights as working class people. UFAF was characterized as, our organization, United Front Against Fascism, was characterized in various ways as left extremists, as gangs. One time the FBI handed out material calling us the gang from Seattle, which was kind of ridiculous. But we countered that by trying to find a middle way, saying, okay, we understand that not everybody wants to engage and can engage in militant mass action, but everybody can do something in taking a stand against white supremacy, xenophobia, etc. So while if all you want to do is write a letter to the editor, that's fine, but take a stand, don't be silent, don't be intimidated. What we must do is, we at United Front Against Fascism are going to keep on mobilizing, because right-wing extremists use terror to rule and to recruit. Those are their main objectives. Over the years, United Front Against Fascism showed a lot of persistence, courage, and tenacity. Every December, we went to Whidbey Island because the Nazis kept trying to go back and hold memorials. Finally, the state closed the park in the winter due to budget cuts, which we took a lot of credit for. And there was one winter we reserved the park before they got there, before they reserved it. So we outsmarted them that way. And every summer we went to Idaho until the Aryan nations quit marching in Coeur d'Alene. And gradually, instead of fear, individuals and communities began to take a stand. Because I don't know if you could really understand, but when Mulgeta Seraw was killed, beaten to death by young skinheads, it was something that really scared the hell out of people. People were terrified. And then you have Nazis in their full regalia with their flags flying and marching in Idaho. People were afraid. So the work that UFAF did in mobilizing communities really helped to change the attitude of people toward what is my responsibility. I'm not just an observer here. This is my responsibility. This is my fight. I have to speak up. And it really helped. This change in understanding and in attitude really helped to undermine the Aryans' ability to recruit. I remember at one of these demonstrations over in Idaho, I talked to a young man who was maybe about 18, and he said he'd been a Nazi skinhead until he went to some things where they were confronted by counter-demonstrators, and he said, they'd been telling me that they were really powerful and massive and strong, and he said, but then when I saw that all these people, thousands of people were against us, I started to think, well, I'm not sure I want to do this. And that was, that showed the power of undermining their power to recruit. UFAF can't take all the credit for the subsiding of the white supremacist activity in the Northwest in the late 90s. There were a lot of factors that led to this, but we were certainly one of them. The Nazis didn't look so tough or appealing to young people if feminists, gays, lesbians, and transgender people, immigrants, Jews, blacks, Roma people, or gypsies, communists and socialists, all the people they hated and demeaned and despised stood up to them. It sort of cut into their macho presentation of themselves, So now I want to show news clips from the 1988 demonstration that you get more of a feeling, because I want you to see what it was like. These are from Portland, and I want to say whenever Radical Women has marched against the Nazis, we've always had the cooperation and support of our branches, and wherever they are, they've always helped. We've always joined forces. So this is coverage. This is coverage from Portland Radical Women.
preparing for the worst tonight. They're worried tomorrow's protest by neo-Nazis and human rights groups will turn violent. A group of Portland residents will be among the counter-demonstrators. Phyllis Burke is here with more on that story. Phyllis?
Well, Julie, an estimated 200 people are expected to protest the skinheads tomorrow. About 50 neo-Nazis plan to hold a memorial service on Whidbey Island for the founder of a white racist group killed there 4 years ago. A small group of Portland residents will be among those demonstrators who plan to tell the skinheads to get lost.
What do we need?
The skinheads are coming to Whidbey Island to honor white supremacist Robert Matthews. In 1984, Matthews died there of smoke inhalation in a fiery standoff with the FBI. The protesters are coming to Whidbey Island to confront racism head-on. Adrienne Weller was busy yesterday passing out leaflets trying to persuade others to join her at the demonstration. Tomorrow, she'll have a small convoy of about 15 people heading for Whidbey Island.
It's been actually fairly easy. People seem to feel that it's important to go, that they want to go, they want to stop it now.
But is Whidbey Island ready for either group?
I'm just going to stay home and keep my kids home.
A lot of Whidbey Island residents don't appreciate all of this attention, neither do the police. Law enforcement from 5 cities and the Washington State Patrol have been called in to assist Whidbey Island deputies.
We have people on both sides very fired up about this issue, and they get together. There is the potential for physical confrontation.
The counter-demonstrators are not going to be causing violence. That's a real twist in reality. They're going to be there to prevent violence.
To find out what goes on firsthand, Channel 2 News will have a crew on Whidbey Island. Coverage of the events there will begin with a live report on our 6:30 newscast tomorrow. Julie?
Phyllis, do we know what the skinheads plan to do tomorrow?
Well, Julie, in the past they've burned crosses at their rallies, but this is supposed to be a vigil. And the White Aryan Resistance, which is sponsoring the memorial gathering, has indicated it wants a peaceful service and a small crowd.
Let's hope so. We'll find out tomorrow. Thank you, Phyllis.
Good evening, everyone. A neo-Nazi gathering this weekend in Whidbey Island, Washington is drawing more protesters than skinheads. More than 200 people showed up to demonstrate against the dozen or so skinheads on hand there. A group from Portland was up early this morning organizing for today's demonstrations at Whidbey Island. They want to confront racism head-on and aren't worried about confronting the skinheads.
I'm more worried about not going, because if I don't go, they're not going to stop. They're not going to get any weaker. So at what point do you decide to confront them? Or do you just decide to let them take over the country?
I agree it's important to stand up to them and send them the message that we're not going to quietly stand by as they try and spread their hate.
Now, one confrontation between a skinhead and some protesters is reported tonight. We have a crew at that rally, and we'll have a live report from Whidbey Island a little later in our newscast.
Good evening, everyone. About 225 people gathered at Whidbey Island State Park north of Seattle today to protest a gathering of skinheads and white supremacists.
Law enforcement officials were worried about possible violence, but the day passed peacefully. Don Reese is up in Washington right now and joins us via satellite on News Star 8. Good evening, Don.
Jeff, Janice, at this hour, neo-Nazi leaders and skinheads are meeting in a private campground, a group campground here. They plan a candlelight vigil later on in memory of a neo-Nazi who died during a standoff with the FBI 4 years ago, not too far from this campground, this state park. Now, a lot of people are pretty angry in the Northwest about this gathering, and just a short time ago, we saw and heard just how angry.
Oh, skinheads, we will rock you!
It's an assault on hate. As a large number of police watch nearby, demonstrators chant, march, and carry signs, taking a stand against racism.
Beat
This protest, organized after news of a skinhead rally here, spread to Seattle and Portland.
I'm a musician, and I don't see how anybody could possibly be racist as a musician because, black people contribute so much to music, and that's one of the many, many reasons why I think it's unbelievable. Racism is unbelievable, but
these people say they're frightened by the growth of racist violence. Demonstrators point to the beating death of Portland's Mulugeta Sarau. In that case, 3 skinheads are charged with murder.
And it's unfortunate that he happened to be a victim of racism in this country. But I think it's up to all of us to stand together in this struggle against hate and bigotry and this Nazi movement, the thing that seemed to have captured the attention of our youngsters.
Skinheads don't go out looking for violence. It comes to us. By the fact that we shave our head and express our beliefs, I mean, there's no denying what we are. And when someone sees us, they know what we stand for, and then they attack us usually.
Forrest Bateman and Ron Herman are part of the reason for the protest. These two are Portland skinheads, here to join racist leaders for a Robert Matthews memorial. Matthews was part of the Order, a group that plotted to overthrow the government. 4 years ago, Matthews shot an FBI agent while escaping arrest at a Portland motel. A manhunt led police to Whidbey Island. A standoff finally ended when an FBI flare set Matthews' house on fire, killing Matthews.
I think he's, to me, he's an idol. He started everything. Got the white man's race, together and stand for one, the whole white race.
Black man was killed. In my town, Chicanos, blacks, and Asians are killing whites. Let's talk about that.
Police tried to keep skinheads and demonstrators apart, but at times it was impossible. A man who says he's a member of the White Aryan Resistance argued with several demonstrators as a large crowd of reporters and photographers stood by. Late in the afternoon, after busloads of protesters returned to Seattle, one of the leaders of the white hate movement finally arrived, Richard Butler, head of the Aryan Nations Church in Hayden Lake, Idaho.
Patrick Henry stood for his convictions. I think Robert Matthews, whether he was right or wrong, he stood for his convictions.
Butler's arrival, the Matthews Memorial, and the presence of skinheads is making some Whidbey Island residents angry.
Yeah, it makes me very mad. Also makes me scared. I've got a child. I don't want my child growing up with people like that as a role model.
But this is just the beginning. In April, Richard Butler plans a much larger gathering of skinheads at his Aryan Nations compound in Hayden Lake. Now, Butler has said in the past that he is very proud of skinheads, these young neo-Nazis that Portland police and other law enforcement officials say are very violent and very dangerous. Jeff, Janice?
Don, obviously a tense situation there. What is security going to be like tonight for the vigil?
There are fewer members of the law enforcement community here right now, Janice, than there were during the daytime, but there are still many deputies from the Island County Sheriff's Department. The sheriff has expressed concern earlier this week. He said he wished he could have 1,000 officers. So there are still some here, and probably they'll stay through the night if that's needed.
All right, Don, thanks a lot. Don Reese reporting from Whidbey Island, where the skinheads have gathered this weekend.
Turn on the lights.
So you can see I didn't exaggerate. I didn't exaggerate. So you might be wondering, why would radical women, why would radical women want to do this work or think it was necessary or have the confidence to do it? I think, first of all, the membership of radical women belong to all the groups that the extremists would like to exterminate. And in Radical Women, we stand up for each other and defend each other. So that's first of all. It's all for one and one for all in Radical Women, and we're going to stand up and fight for each other, for each other's rights. That's the first thing. Secondly, Radical Women are socialists, and we've studied history, and we know that fascist groups and organizations and ideas grow during periods of economic crisis when people are looking for scapegoats. They aren't just harmless fringe groups. They can grow into mass movements to smash unions and the working class and do the dirty work of corporate interests, which are trying to terrorize workers into submission. This is basically what happened in Germany. First, Hitler's group was just a small group of street thugs who were recruiting on campuses. And I remember reading something that Hitler had written in which he said, in the first 7 years of our organizing, we could have been stopped if we'd been met with force. But we weren't met with enough force, and so we continued to grow. And why weren't they met with more? Why weren't the Nazis met with more force in Germany? Because it took many years for them to grow into a movement that was capable of gaining power in the government, or power over the government. Well, the reason they weren't met with sufficient force is that the left was divided in Germany and did not make the kind of united front that you really have to have. If you're going to fight Nazis, you have to have a united front on the left. And why is the left so important? Couldn't maybe just a group of progressives and liberals do this? Well, I think progressives and liberals are an important part of a united front, but the left is important to the united front because only the left, as socialists, have an analysis of Nazis as a byproduct of capitalism. And there's no way to get rid of Nazis, ultimately, unless you get rid of capitalism. Fascism grows out of the scarcity that exists in society under capitalism. There's not enough to go around. Why is there so much scapegoating of immigrants today? It's because people feel, well, there's not enough to go around, and the immigrants are taking what might belong to me. So fascism is a product of capitalism, and people on the left, or groups on the left, whether they're socialists, anarchists, Trotskyists, Stalinists, whatever their ideas are, they have a basic understanding of capitalism and the role of fascists in capitalism. So we go, there are a lot of different debates on the left and a lot of, sometimes very strong disagreements on the left. But when it comes to fighting Nazis, we have the left has to join together. And I think if you walk out of here tonight with any other idea, I think that's the most important one. And there's a really good book called The Struggle Against Fascism in Germany by Leon Trotsky that has a lot of the lessons from the struggle against fascism in Germany. It's an excellent book, and I recommend it very highly. And if you just want something short, there's Leon Trotsky's pamphlet, Fascism, What It Is and How to Fight It, which is also very, very educational. The lesson that we learned from our organizing in United Front Against Fascism is one that we learned also by reading Trotsky, but we learned it both in practice and in theory and history. And that is that white supremacists who espouse a fascist conspiratorial ideology are not a police problem. They're a social and political problem. And that tends to be, liberals tend to think that they're a police problem. They're a criminal problem. They're a criminal element and have to be dealt with by the police. They're our problem as working women and men, and as radicals we have a really particular responsibility to stand together whatever our differences are. Now, some of you might think that this is all ancient history. I can't believe that Whidbey Island was 21 years ago now. Seems like only yesterday to me, but then I realize sometimes when I'm talking to people that weren't born in 1988, so it's a long time ago. And Hitler's a long time ago. Maybe that's old news, the Second World War was fought and the Nazis were defeated in Germany and put in jail, and that's the end of the story. Well, the murder of 9 people since the beginning of this year by whites with ties ties to white supremacist groups really highlights, I think, the need for radical women to look at what's going on and also to defend abortion clinics, where a lot of these far-right extremists target their anger and their recruiting. The immigrant rights movement, where they're also trying to recruit people who are dissatisfied and unhappy with the economic and political situation in this country. And we have to be ready to take action again on a moment's notice. Two of the people who were killed last month were members of a Latino family, a man and his 9-year-old daughter. They were murdered in their home by rabid xenophobes from the Northwest, a man and a woman. Shauna Ford spoke at an event that was held in Everett in 2007 with the founder of the Minutemen, Jim Gilchrist. And it was an event that was attended by, and you see this is where there's the overlap, this event attended by the woman who's now a murderer, or, well, she's an accused murderer, was attended by, the rally that she held in Everett was attended by a candidate for Snohomish County Sheriff, representatives of 3 presidential candidates, including Ron Paul, were there, and other candidates who came to this forum, which was on the immigration issue. Well, I'm proud to say that we were there. Radical Women and FSP were there, and part of a protest of that meeting in Everett. And it's come out since this woman was arrested, her name is Shauna Ford, that the man she was arrested with for the murder has now been charged with the murder of a homeless immigrant in Tri-Cities, I think it was, or Yakima, maybe it was Yakima, 10 years ago. So, you know, there are attacks that are going on that, I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but there are people who are being hurt and killed by racists that we don't even know about. I mean, sometimes I could go into that more in discussion, because sometimes you really wonder about the things you read in the newspaper. I imagine, so that's the woman, Shauna Ford. I imagine that most of you know that Scott Roeder, who killed Dr. Tiller, a defender of women's right to abortion, and Dr. Tiller was one of a handful to perform late-term abortions, was engaged in a long campaign of harassment and intimidation against the clinic that Dr. Tiller operated. What you might not know is that Scott Roeder was affiliated with a far-right movement called the Freemen that do not recognize the U.S. government as legitimate because it's been taken over by ZOG, the Zionist occupation government, a favorite anti-Semitic target. The Freemen provided a lot of the recruits to the militia movement in the 90s, and many of the proponents and practitioners of anti-abortion violence, such as the Army of God, have emerged from this stew of far-right militia neo-Nazi movements. Another man who committed a murder that I'm sure you read about, James von Braun. He's the 88-year-old anti-Semite who killed Stephen Tyrone Jones, an African-American guard at the Holocaust Museum in June. He has a website that's still up claiming that there is a Jewish conspiracy to destroy the white gene pool, and expressing what you can read in many far-right tracts, things like, and this is a quote, "White men are laughed at, they're women bred by stronger men." This is a big issue with the Nazis, that we women should be bred by the right guys. Yeah, and which is the one reason why we as feminists are very much opposed to the Nazis. We'll choose who are bred. Thank you very much. Anyway, I don't know, you have to make some jokes as you go along because it's just too grim otherwise. Another guy who was, he was not engaged in any of these recent murders, but Eric Rudolph, who bombed 2 abortion clinics, which maimed staff, also put pipe bombs in gay bars. So these people are not single issue, and they're not lone assassins, as what the newspaper always, that's always the first thing you read, is that they're lone assassins. What they are is the underbelly of the Fox News crowd that listened to Bill O'Reilly compare Dr. Taylor to a pedophile and Al-Qaeda year in and year out. The far-right evangelical homophobes, the abortionist murder fanatics, the white male sperm is sacred Aryans, and the immigrant hordes are taking over the country militia. They're a product of the American firsters like Pat Buchanan and the radio show racists who trash talk immigrants and abortion providers every hour of every day in this country. The lone nut theory is used by the police to put the public to sleep. You know, that says there's nothing to worry about, you know, single wing nut at work, we're taking care of it, but we can't be asleep. It's not, that's not the situation at all. And of course, those of us who have fought for abortion rights know that the bombers and the killers are all part of the anti-abortion movement. There was a period in the 80s when radical women went up to Everett every Saturday morning to defend the Everett abortion or women's health clinic up there from a bunch of right-wingers who would gather. We would get up there at 6 o'clock in the morning to stake out the best site to defend the clinic. And one of the guys that was on the other line bombed the clinic in the end and was escaped to Canada with the help of a leader of the far right in the Republican Party. So we know that the wingnuts and the movement, the respectables, who are in the Republican Party, et cetera, are actually working together. In the U.S., between 1995 and 2005, there was really a decline in Nazi Klan activity in the United States, due in large part to the grassroots movement, which wasn't just here in the Northwest, but was really took off around the country. They also, the far right, the extremists also suffered some leadership splits. They robbed banks and shot up schools, and they ended up in jail, where of course they continued to recruit, and they were infiltrated by the FBI. So it wasn't just UFAF and groups like UFAF that were responsible for their decline, but also their own problems. But they didn't go away, and but they didn't have the big recruiting ability that they had when they used to hold world congresses every April in Idaho. Today, the far right, the extremist right, the white supremacists, the Nazis, the national, I think it's called the National Socialists something, which are Nazis, are growing again in the U.S. and across Europe. The crisis of capitalism combined with massive displacement of people who are forced to flee their home countries by war, by political turmoil, by poverty and free trade are driving the proliferation of fascist gangs and movements worldwide. And the groups can run the gamut from skinhead gangs to established political parties. In June in Europe, elections were held for the European Parliament, and far-right, out and out racist parties made big gains in those European elections. In the Netherlands, an anti-Islam Freedom Party, well, they call themselves a Freedom Party, won 17% of the vote and became the second large, got the second number of votes of any party in Netherlands. In Italy, the Northern League, which is a far-right organization, doubled its vote. There were several places where anti-Gypsy or anti-Roma parties made big gains in Hungary and Romania. And in Britain, they got the far right got 2 seats in the European Parliament, and I mean these people are Hitlerites from the National Front, and they want Britain for whites only, and they want to expel anybody who's not white. One piece of good news is that when they held their press conference to announce, or to talk about their election, there were people there from United Against Fascism who threw eggs at them, and they had to leave. They never finished their press conference. So, but that's small comfort when you think about how I think it was they got 1 million votes. So that's bad news. In our hemisphere, just to wind up here, in our hemisphere, the passage of NAFTA in 1992 drastically increased immigration from Mexico as the economic situation there deteriorated. And free trade agreements in the rest of Central America had a similar impact, and immigration from Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador and Nicaragua also grew. At the same time, the free trade policies affected workers in other ways. Well-paid jobs in the heavy industry were lost, unemployment rose, and outsourcing resulted in the loss of union membership. Immigrants became the scapegoats for all those frustrating developments, even in the labor movement, where for a period workers without papers were seen as scabs because they worked below prevailing wages, which was in construction. And there was a battle in the labor movement to get the labor movement to defend immigrant workers, and to some degree we won, and I think somewhere we have a resolution here that we worked on and passed and got unions to adopt. Is that it? That's an old one. No. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, to defend immigrant workers as an important part of the working class, and we managed in Washington State to get the Washington State Labor Council to adopt that, and other states adopted it, and the AFL-CIO turned around somewhat. But the labor movement is still not defending immigrant workers from ICE raids and from roundups and other things, and I think there's much more that the labor movement needs to do, partly out of a sense of self-survival, because the immigrant workers, with and without papers, are the most militant section of the working class today, and it's in everybody's self-interest to defend them because it will strengthen the labor movement. However, the effects of free trade, increased immigration, more frustration among native workers here in this country, was then followed by, in 2001, the attack on the Twin Towers. And the Bush administration whipped up the fear of terrorists, Muslims and Middle Easterners. And so now anti-immigration attitudes and scapegoating were linked up with terrorism. Now we got to stop the terrorists coming across the border illegally. Nationalism and racism became the incendiary mix out of which the far right has grown over the last few years. Today, the neo-Nazi movement is rebuilding itself on fear about immigration, fear about the election of the first African-American president, and if you read some of the websites, this is a constant refrain. You might remember not too long after Obama was elected, there was this thing, Obama's going to outlaw guns. It was a wild rumor, but the far right jumps on it and uses it to organize. I also think fear of gay marriage has also, I mean, I was really shocked to read the statistics about attacks, which I did for this talk, but I didn't include them all, but attacks on gays and lesbians and transvestites. I mean, it's gone up since, I think, the gay marriage movement has been pushing forward. I think there's fear about disobedient women. We're always a cause of worry for a great many people. And all of this is seen as signs of moral decay in a once proud country ruled by superior whites. So some of the Nazis have taken off their uniforms and they're trawling the anti-immigrant movement and the internet, looking for likely recruits to their conspiracy theories, their Armageddon scenarios, and the mythology about the natural superiority of straight, white, Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Amid the current economic uncertainty and skyrocketing unemployment, they will find recruits among the habitually unemployed and the frightened middle class. And one of the things when I was thinking about this, I looked into unemployment, and Oregon has the second highest unemployment in the country. And wherever there's unemployment, that's where Nazis go to organize. When the forest industry began to go downhill in Washington State, the Nazis headed out to Fork and to other places where people were unemployed and began trying to organize out there. So we can bet that they're also going to be going to Michigan, which has the highest unemployment rate, and trying to recruit. That's their method. I think our job is, as radical women, is to offer working and poor people, and as not just radical women, but as radicals, all of us, regardless of whether we're members of radical women or not, is to offer working and poor people an alternative message to that is offered by the Nazis and the means for fighting for what we need. Our message has to be class solidarity and defense of the most vulnerable as an expression of self-defense. You know, we always, in Radical Women, say we have the right to self-defense. We're not going to let anybody roll up over the top of us. It says that isn't going to help the world, make the world a better place. We have to show working people why and how we can replace this system with a more humane socialist system that will do away with the deprivation that leads to the rise of fascism. And we must show the courage to stand up against the bullies and the terrorists of the far right. And I'm glad to say and proud to say that Radical Women is such an organization with a long history of doing just that. And I want to encourage you when we're finished to come up and maybe get some of these are reprints and flyers that we put out. This is over time. This is Radical Women, Monica Hill, who's here. Radical Women in Los Angeles organized against the Nazis in Simi Valley. That was a tough site, a tough place to do it. But this is the flyer from their event. This is a report. This is a report on one of the rallies that we held, and this is a man whose son was killed by skinheads who came to the rally and who spoke. This was the program of United Front Against Fascism, which was really simple, but it worked. It was very clear. You know, we all stand together. We're going to defend. We're going to be militant. We're going to be disciplined. We're going to be organized. We're going to be serious. We're not going to engage in a bunch of bullshit power struggles, and that was it carried us for many, many years. There's a copy of the resolution that we got passed in the Washington State Labor Council, and one from Radical Women about defending the clinics, the armed defense of clinics, which maybe some other people want to talk about. The final thing I want to say two more very brief things. One, I want to draw your attention to this wonderful article written by Monica Hill, which is about Italy and the assaults on the Romani people who are gypsies. They prefer to be called Romani, not gypsies. gypsy. And they're just terrible, terrible attacks that are going on in Italy. And this is a very good article that she wrote for our newspaper, The Freedom Socialist. And just this came out in the newspaper while I was preparing the report. This is gangs in Northern Ireland target Romani gypsies, and they're attacking people in their homes and trying to drive them out, because the Romani, many of whom lived in Romania, have since the fall of the worker states have left Romania and are now in Europe as refugees, and they've been targeted. So, and finally, I want to say, even today, we still have reverberations from our victories in fighting the Nazis. David Irving, who is a right-wing Holocaust denier from England, who's a real big shot in the crazy, nutty, far-right, extremist, anti-Semitic movement, is going to be speaking this weekend. The last time that we know he came to town to speak was he was going to speak on